Hello, and welcome to the last session, the fourth session for Chapter 6, Bone Tissue. Today we're going to discuss how bone growth occurs after you're born, so bone growth in length and as well as in thickness. Then we'll take a very quick look at some of the hormones that control this process, and finally we'll talk very little bit about calcium and how bones are important for the homeostasis of calcium levels in the blood. So before we get there, though, I want to review what we did in the last section, which was the growth of bones through the endochondral ossification process. And there's a series of pictures here that might help us. We'll walk our way through them and talk about them a little bit, and then we'll get into bone growth after birth. So you begin with the so-called hyaline cartilage model. So we have started off with mesenchymal cells. They condense, they form a pattern that looks kind of like the bone, and then they become chondroblasts. They lay down the cartilage matrix. They get covered with a layer, a membrane, the perichondrium. And as that proceeds, some of the cells in the center start to enlarge. We start to have cell death. And then we introduce the bone collar, which increases that cell death. And then we penetrate the bone with a artery. That artery brings in osteoclasts, which are going to be digesting and breaking down not just the bone collar, but the calcified center of the model, calcified cartilage. And that process of growth is going to move towards the ends of the bones. So the very light purple color represents cartilage. The darker material that you see out here, that would be the perichondrium or the periosteum, and then the light material that you see right there, that would be the bone collar. So that growth is proceeding out towards the ends of the bone. Then we start our secondary ossification center at each end of the bone. So we get, again, cell enlargement, the penetration of an artery, and then the hollowing out of the cartilage, the calcified cartilage, and the replacement of that with bone tissue, spongy bone. While all of that, of course, is going on, we're still moving towards the ends of the bones with my primary ossification center. And eventually we're going to end up with a thin plate of cartilage called the epiphyseal plate, a thin edge of cartilage at the ends of the bones. That's will be our articular cartilage. And eventually, once you get to the adult stage, this plate is going to be removed, and what's left is the epiphyseal line. So what we're going to talk about next is what's happening here at the epiphyseal plate. So what you know is that your size, how tall you are when you're born, is certainly not going to be the same as when you are an adult. And in order for you to increase in size and length, something happens to your bones. They have to grow. And that growth is going to take place here at the epiphyseal plate in this direction in length. And we'll also talk about how bone grows in diameter, because the bones not just can't simply grow in length, they also have to thicken as well as you grow older. And so that's going to be something we'll be looking at right now. So let's talk about that. Let's begin that discussion. And we'll title this area Bone Growth. So bone growth. And we're going to start with an interstitial. Growth, which is growth in length. Excuse me. Excuse me. I might have to do that several more times. Some weird thing goes on with my sneezing sometimes. Okay, so growth in length. And this is going to occur at the epiphyseal plate. So the epiphyseal plate. So what is the epiphyseal plate? This is going to be a layer of cartilage in the metaphysis. This layer consists of 4 zones. And let's go ahead and start with an image, and then we'll describe these zones. So here are the zones. Starting here at the bottom, we're going to talk about the zone of resting cartilage, the zone of proliferating cartilage, the zone of hypertrophic cartilage, and the zone of calcified cartilage. So all of these zones that we've just identified, 1, 2, 3, 4, is the part of the epiphyseal plate. Now, if you look at the image, and we'll slide in just a little bit more, you can see that this area looks like normal cartilage. And in fact, that's exactly what it is, just normal cartilage. The zone of proliferating cartilage, if you're looking at it, you're looking at a bunch of stacked lacuna and stacked cells, like stacking quarters, one on top of the other. That's the zone of proliferating cartilage. And as we move up into this zone, we're seeing that those cells are growing larger. They're enlarging, and hence the term hypertrophic. And then we have a very thin layer, which is right here. This is the calcified cartilage. So this is dead material. The cells are no longer living here, and the cartilage itself is calcified. And then we actually get to spongy bone, that region right there. So what we're going to see is a process by which we can increase the length of the bone. So let's first describe each of these zones and then talk about how that increase in length happens as the result of the way this layer, this epiphyseal plate, behaves. Okay. So we'll take a look at that. So it consists of 4 layers, and we'll just list the layers and then we'll describe each one. So the zone of resting cartilage, number 2, the zone of proliferating cartilage, number 3, the zone of hypertrophic cartilage, and number 4, the zone of calcified cartilage. So those are the zones, and what we're going to do is we're going to describe the behavior of each of those zones. So starting with the zone of resting cartilage. Okay. So this is going to be nearest the epiphysis. So that's the zone nearest the end of the bone. Okay. It is going to consist of small, scattered chondrocytes. it's not going to play a role in actual growth. So it has no role in the actual growth of the bone. What its function is to anchor or glue this whole thing to the bone, okay? So no function. In growth. Okay? And what it's going to do is it's going to anchor the epiphyseal plate to the epiphysis. That's its just. It's the glue that holds the thing together. The next zone is the zone of proliferating cartilage. Excuse me for just a second. Thank you. So the zone of proliferating cartilage. And here we have larger chondrocytes. That is to say, larger than what we saw in the zone of resting cartilage. Okay. And they are stacked like coins. Okay. So we get this effect here. All right. And so obviously, if we've got a lot of cells stacked, we have to grow those cells, and that's going to be through mitotic division. So mitotic activity grows new cells, and that's how they become stacked on one another. Okay? The next zone, it's the zone of hypertrophy, or hypertrophic cartilage. Okay. And so what we get here are enlarged cells. Okay. And they still remain in columns, but they're enlarged. So okay. So we get this excess enlargement. So what we're getting now is this effect. Still stacked, but now larger. So at this point, let's talk about growth. These last two zones that we've just identified, the zone of proliferating cartilage and the zone of hypertrophic cartilage, they are going to contribute to growth. Here, because we're adding new cells, we're stacking one cell on top of the other and creating a larger stack. Here, because those stacks are enlarging, each of the coins in the stack enlarges, thus pushing the material in growth. Okay, so growth is the result of the zone of proliferating cartilage and the zone of hypertrophic enlargement. So adding new cells and increasing the size of the cells. That's where we're getting growth. That thickens, or lengthens, I should say, the bone. And of course, this is happening, remember, at both ends of the bone. The final zone, which is going to be the zone of calcification, is only a few cells thick. Only a few cells thick. And it consists of calcified matrix, and that would be cartilage matrix, and dead cells. And what's going to happen here at this zone is the calcified matrix is removed by osteoclast, and new bone tissue is added by osteoclasts. The interesting thing is that, so we're replacing the cartilage with bone tissue. So we chew away at the calcified matrix and then replace it with bone tissue. And that bone tissue is going to be spongy bone. And then right behind that, we're going to remove that spongy bone, so we're enlarging the medullary cavity. The end result is growth in length. So let's take a look at what the textbook has offered, which is a fairly decent representation of what's going to happen. So one of the things I want you to notice is that this distance from this edge to this edge in the two pictures is not changing. What's simply happening is this section is moving forward and up and pushing the end of the bone with it. So the size of the medullary cavity is increasing, as you can see. Okay? So resting cartilage, that's gluing this to all of this. Okay? Zone of proliferating cartilage, we're adding new cells, thus increasing the size of this material. Zone of hypertrophic cartilage, we're increasing the size of these cells. So the number is increasing, the size is increasing, and that is going to ultimately widen this. But remember that at this level here, the calcified cartilage, we're removing that material as we create it and adding new spongy bone, and then behind that, removing the spongy bone. So ultimately, even though we're increasing the distance, the ultimate effect is simply to move this forward. The thickness never changes. It just moves forward in this direction because we're adding stuff here and taking it away here. Adding here, taking it away here. Adding here, taking it away here. And the whole bone is growing in length as a result of that process. Okay? Okay? That's bone growth in length, or interstitial bone growth. So bone length increases only at the epiphyseal plate. Okay. Thickness stays the same. So we're growing in length, but thickness is not changing. So, of course, we're going to have to thicken the bone as it grows in length, and that's going to be the next thing we look at. I just want to finish off a couple of things that are related to this bone growth in length. So a couple of things that are part of the story here. Number one, a fracture in the epiphyseal plate will often stop the whole process. So a fracture in the epiphyseal plate can stop bone growth. If you're a young person and you're still growing and you have an accident and you fracture a bone and that fracture disturbs the epiphyseal plate, sometimes that will cause the whole process to come to an end. And so that bone will not complete its full growth. And you can literally end up with one limb, a leg, an arm, which is shorter than the other. So it's very important that you pay attention to this, particularly if you're raising kids, because you can end up with a child that has a leg that's shorter on one side than on the other side. When the process finally stops naturally, then what we're going to get is the epiphyseal line, which is the remnant of the epiphyseal plate. Okay. And finally, the last bit of information is that the clavicle bone is the last bone to stop growing in length. Okay. The last bone to stop growing in length. Another interesting fact, so remember that this process, the epiphyseal plate, is at both the proximal and distal end of the bone. And typically, the distal end of a bone will cease to stop growing before the proximal end of the bone. So they don't coordinate, they don't stop both at the same time. And often what happens is the distal end of the bone will stop growing while the proximal end of the bone is still going through a growth process. And so this was actually highlighted to me when I was raising children. My oldest daughter decided to play football with the football team in high school, and she was tackling someone, and she broke the tibia and the fibula at the ankle. And the doctors were very concerned that this was going to end up having her have a leg that's shorter than the other. Fortunately for her, that process of growth had stopped at the distal end of the bone, but was still in process at the proximal end. So she ended up with two legs that were normal length. But it was we were kind of concerned about that while it straightened itself out. Okay, so let's talk about growth and thickness. Which is what? Appositional growth. Okay. So I think that a picture is very enlightening here for us to look at. And what I'm going to show you, again, from your textbook, is this series of pictures right here. And the basic pattern is going to be this. We're going to add new bone material to the outside, to the outer edge of a bone. At the same time, we're going to remove material on the inner edge of the bone. So, yes, the wall does tend to thicken over time, but the medullary cavity is also growing over time. So what we see here is not just simply a thickening of compact bone so that you end up with a very thick wall at the end, but what you see is a thickening, yes, of the wall, but also an enlargement of the medullary cavity. So what we're going to do is we're going to add material to the outside of the bone and take away material from the inside of the bone. Now, adding to the outside is going to be a little bit ahead of and a little bit more than the removal of material. So you end up indeed with a thicker wall, but you also end up with a bigger medullary cavity at the same time. So it is a process of adding material to the outside, removing it on the inside until you finally reach a thickness that is commensurate with being an adult. Okay. All right, so bone growth and thickness, appositional bone growth. Oh, and by the way, let's look at this series of pictures as well. So what we're going to do, it's going to be a series of steps, which are nicely drawn out here, as we're adding bone material. So that bone material, here is the periosteum. Remember, that's going to be the source of new osteoblasts. So they're going to migrate out and they're going to start adding bone material. And keep in mind, again, this is living tissue. The periosteum is living tissue. So it can grow at the same time bone material is being added. And as the bone material is added in this area and in this area, we're going to create two ridges in between, or a flanking, I should say, a blood vessel. So that's our periosteal blood vessel. And we're adding new bone material here on one side and on the other side. Eventually those two ridges will come together and they will end up forming a circle around that blood vessel. And then as that happens, the blood vessel now is trapped within a cavity, a canal, if you will, and we can reduce the size of that canal because remember, this tissue is essentially the same as this tissue here. It is going to be lining the blood vessel. We have the ability to add new osteoblasts here, so we can thicken this wall. And eventually what happens? We get a series of concentric circles around the artery. We create the osteon, and that process is just going to move out. So growth is being added here at the edge. Growth is being added here at the edge. And initially that growth is going to be spongy bone. And then it's transformed into compact bone. So in the images that you're looking at, it looks like we're simply adding compact bone. Not true. We're adding a very, very thin layer of spongy bone, which is being remodeled at the same time to create the compact bone. And then we end up with this situation right here, where we have a series of concentric circles of mineralized bone tissue surrounding a central blood vessel. So we get our central canal and our osteon in that process. And we're simply going to build out the wall in that fashion here. And at the same time, on the inside wall, as I mentioned, we're going to take away material until we finally get to the adult bone, where we have the right size medullary cavity and the right thickness for the wall of the shaft, the diaphysis of the bone. Okay, so appositional growth. So what we're going to do is we're going to add new bone tissue on the outer surface from new osteoblasts that arise from the periosteum. Okay. So they're coming from the periosteum. And at the same time, osteoclasts remove bone tissue on the inside or the inner wall of the medullary cavity. Spongy bone is produced first and then replaced by compact bone. All right. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the process by which we thicken a bone as opposed to growing its length. Let's talk a little bit about hormonal control of this process. We're not going to spend a lot of time here. You will see more of this when you get into 40C and talk about the endocrine system. So hormonal regulation. Of bone growth. So we're going to divide this into two periods. Before puberty and then after puberty. So before puberty, we're going to get the important hormones are going to be human growth hormone, which is HG big H. Okay. And this is coming from the anterior pituitary gland. And insulin, like growth factors, which is coming from bone and the liver, and thyroid hormones, which is coming from, obviously, the thyroid gland. So this is a rich mixture of hormones interacting to create growth in the young person, something before puberty. Okay. During puberty, it's not that these hormones are no longer playing a role, but we're going to start creating now differences between men and women in terms of the bone structure. And that's going to be the sex hormones. And for the male, that would be testosterone, which is coming from the testes, and estrogens. And it's a plural because there's more than one of this type of hormone. And this is coming from the ovaries. And what they are going to do is they're going to either build the male skeletal system or the female skeletal system. Some of those differences you are already familiar with because you've studied the difference between male pelvis and a female pelvis. Okay, so they are going to produce the difference in terms of male and female skeletal systems. Okay, so that's during puberty. That's all I want to cover as far as hormonal regulation. The story obviously is much more complex than that, but for our purposes, we're going to leave it there. The last and final thing I want to talk about is the bone's role in calcium homeostasis. So it turns out that the bones are the major reservoir for calcium. About 99% of the total amount of calcium is stored in the bones. So we have a lot of it in bones. Then the other thing to consider is that blood calcium levels are highly regulated. Okay. And even small changes can be deadly. So obviously, then, the bones become a source of calcium in order to make sure that there's enough calcium in floating and dissolved in the blood so that you don't get bad things happening. So, for example, if you have too much calcium, you can go into cardiac arrest. If you have too little calcium, you can go into respiratory arrest. Both of these things are not good. You'll learn about that in 40B. Both of those do not have good outcomes. So calcium is very important, and you have a lot of it in the bones. Not only that, but calcium is used for a number of other kinds of functions in the body. So, for example, nerve cells, enzymes, and blood clotting all depend on calcium to be at their proper levels in the body. So, therefore, bones act as a buffer for calcium levels. That is an S, in the blood. Too much calcium and we can put it into bones. Not enough calcium, we can take it out of bones. Okay. Hormones are going to play a role here. They're going to regulate the process. And two hormones in particular are going to be the players in regulating calcium levels in the blood. Number one, parathyroid hormone, which is PTH, all capital letters. Okay. And this is coming from the parathyroid gland. And as you might imagine, based on the name, the parathyroid gland sits right next to and is tucked almost into the thyroid gland. And this is going to promote bone breakdown, that is the release of bone tissue. And if you recall, the cells that are going to break down bone tissue is going to be the osteoclast. And if we looked at that picture, we saw that the minerals are being released into the interstitial fluid. So the parathyroid hormone is going to directly impact the behavior of osteoclasts. And so it's going to promote or increase, it will increase the number and activity of osteoclasts. The calcium that's released then is going to be recovered when it's filtered by the kidney. So it's kind of a two-part story. You're going to increase the calcium levels by breaking down bone. The increased calcium then, instead of being filtered out and ending up in your urine, is going to be captured in the kidney and saved there. So the parathyroid hormone also has an effect inside the kidney. Okay. The other hormone is calcitonin. And this is coming from the thyroid gland. And this is going to promote bone formation by inhibiting the activity of osteoclasts. So the key here is osteoclasts. You increase their activity and you get more calcium in the blood. You reduce their activity and you get less calcium in the blood. Okay. And that is being controlled ultimately by different hormones. Okay. So ladies and gentlemen, that finishes up the presentation for Chapter 6, which is bone tissue. The next set of lectures I will be posting will be on the lab for muscle identification. And then following that will be the last chapter we cover, which I believe is Chapter 10, which is muscle tissue. So ladies and gentlemen, we are definitely coming to the end. Good luck. I will see you later.